Thanks, Terry. Over the past couple of days, we've heard a number of talks on how climate change may fundamentally change reefs as we know them. And for those that depend on reefs for their livelihoods, these changes have the potential to be devastating. And so these studies on the impacts to ecosystems are, of course, needed and laudable, but that's only one side of the coin. And for stakeholders such as fishermen, for policymakers, and for managers, a question of perhaps equal relevance is how will coastal societies be able to adapt to and cope with the changes, these changes presented by climate change. And this is broadly the study of vulnerability. And so today I'm going to talk about the vulnerability of coastal communities to climate change impacts on coral reef fishes. Now, definitions can vary, but vulnerability is generally considered the degree to which a system is susceptible to and unable to cope with the adverse effects of a chronic stress or a stochastic disturbance. Vulnerability can vary across spatial and temporal scales and for different people within a society. For example, the poor or migrants are often considered more vulnerable. Now, in social science research, there's a long history of studies into the vulnerability to disasters, to famine, to poverty, and to environmental change. But few studies have looked at vulnerability in the context of these changes specific to coral reef ecosystems. So as a focal lens for our study on the impacts of, or the vulnerability of coastal communities to climate change, we did a study of 29 coastal communities throughout 5 countries along the eastern coastline of Africa and the islands of the Indian Ocean. Now this is a critical study region because millions of some of the world's most impoverished people depend directly on reef resources. And reefs were extensively damaged by the 1998 coral bleaching event. So there's been a number of different frameworks to examine vulnerability to environmental change, but these typically talk about 3 key components. This is exposure, sensitivity, and adaptive capacity. Now, I'll briefly go over how we've operationalized each of these concepts. I'll try to blend the not too much detail with enough so that you know what we're doing. So exposure, in terms of vulnerability, is considered the degree to which a system is stressed by climatic events and environmental conditions. And this includes the magnitude, frequency, and disturbance of, say, a temperature anomaly or a cyclone. In the context of coral reefs, exposure can vary by latitude, by prevailing winds, and by oceanographic conditions, which can make a particular site more or less susceptible to these impacts. So we looked at 11 different environmental conditions expected to be related to coral bleaching, and we synthesized these into a single exposure model. We then tested these with in situ coral bleaching data from over 200 sites, collected over 2 different bleaching events, and found reasonable correspondence. So what this allowed us to do is figure out for a particular location how susceptible the reefs there were to these sort of thermal anomalies. Now, adaptive capacity is what social scientists call a latent characteristic or a latent trait, and it refers to the preconditions that enable adaptation to change. Now, we've defined adaptive capacity as the ability of households to anticipate and respond to changes in coral reef ecosystems and fisheries, and to minimize, cope with, and recover from the consequences. Now, adaptive capacity can be thought of as having 5 constituent components. These include the assets that can be drawn upon in times of need, learning to recognize change, attributing this change to their causal factors, and assessing potential response strategies. A society's ability to organize and act collectively, the flexibility to change strategies, and the agency to determine whether to change or not. Now, importantly, conceptually, adaptive capacity is a multi-scale concept, and that means, so we've talked about the local scale, that's what our study is about, and this includes the individual, the household, and the community scale, but you can also have larger scale issues of adaptive capacity, and this can be facilitatory or inhibitory, right? So you could have a very corrupt governance regime that makes it very, very difficult to adapt at that local scale. So you can have things at different scales interacting in various ways. We're primarily concentrating on the local scale here. So we operationalized 4 components of adaptive capacity by conducting over 1,500 household surveys in the region. And based on our definition of adaptive capacity and existing literature, we looked at 8 indicators of adaptive capacity. We used expert opinion of 10 local and international scientists to weight the relative importance of these indicators. and used analytical hierarchy process to aggregate these into a single scale of adaptive capacity. And you can see the scale there, so you can see each community there, their total level of adaptive capacity, and the relative contributions of that by each of these different indicators. The point here is that each community then has a score of their local level of adaptive capacity. Now, sensitivity in the context of environmental change is the state of susceptibility to harm from perturbations or long-term trends. And it can be affected by things like the level of dependence on resources and the technologies used to harvest them. Now, consistent with other studies and protocols, we developed a metric of sensitivity which is based on a community's level of dependence on natural resources. But we used a novel network-based approach. So based on our 1,500 household surveys in the region, we asked people to list all of the jobs that people did to bring in food or money into their household and rank them in terms of their relative order of importance. We then used network analysis to visualize relationships between and levels of dependence on these key occupational sectors and what we refer to as a livelihood landscape. And here's an example of a livelihood landscape from coastal Kenya. And you can see that the informal sector and farming are large centralized nodes with lots of incoming and outgoing links to other occupational sectors. Fishing and fish trading, off to the left in bold there, are also large. You can see there's lots of participation as indicated by the size of the node, and they also have linkages to most other economic sectors there. So we developed a metric of sensitivity that incorporated the proportion of households engaged in the fishery, i.e. the size of the node, the linkages between sectors, so whether these households also engaged in non-fisheries occupations, and the directionality of these linkages. So did people consistently rank fishing as being more important than, say, agriculture or tourism, or vice versa? And this allowed us to develop a single metric of sensitivity for each community. We then plotted these three dimensions of vulnerability on a single plot, with sensitivity on the y-axis, exposure denoted by the size of the bubble, and adaptive capacity on the x. But note that axis is reversed going from right to left, so that more vulnerable communities are in the top right, and less vulnerable communities are in the bottom left. Now, it was done this way because local and national policy actions can directly influence both sensitivity and adaptive capacity. Thus, these axes are movable where there's the political will to do so. But exposure to coral bleaching is not something that can be readily influenced by local level action. Yet, as some of the previous speakers discussed, it is something that you may want to consider in adaptation policies and strategies. So importantly, the countries are organized by color based on red being most vulnerable to dark green being least vulnerable. And what we can see, these are based on the national level averages of these dimensions of vulnerability, and we can see considerable spread both within and between countries. So what this figure does is help us unpack which areas have different types of vulnerability and provide some insights into where different types of vulnerability reduction strategies will be most appropriate and viable. So for example, in the top left, communities will primarily require strategies to reduce sensitivity. In the bottom right, communities will primarily require strategies to build adaptive capacity. And communities in the top right will ultimately require both. Now, these distinctions and the underlying sources of vulnerability are important because different policy tools are required to reduce different or specific dimensions of vulnerability. For example, one strategy will be required to reduce sensitivity, and other strategies will be required to build adaptive capacity. Now, these strategies vary across spatial and temporal scales. So we developed a framework to help local managers and policymakers distinguish the scale at which key actions occur and the types of vulnerability strategies they address. Right? And very briefly, I'll just give a few examples of these. In the short term at the local scale, emphasis may be put on reducing the impacts of the most vulnerable, right? And so this could include, for example, evacuations from the most vulnerable sites, which would address exposure, diversification within the fishery, which would address sensitivity, improved markets and information terms, which would help bolster adaptive capacity, and adaptive management approaches, such as temporarily imposing or removing fisheries closures, which can address multiple facets of vulnerability. In the medium and longer term, right, emphasis shifts towards meaningful investments to enhance adaptive capacity and reduce sensitivity. This can include, for example, supplementary lively activities. This, if you remember the livelihood landscape, this would essentially be increasing the linkages to other economic sectors. It can be strengthening community groups and social networks, what social scientists consider social capital. Improvements to coastal infrastructure and migration to non-coastal areas. In the longer term, we're talking about probably greater than 5 years, we have things like alternative livelihoods, transitions out of fisheries. And I know that's a lot of people's sort of favorite throwaway line they put in the paper, we just need to give fishers different jobs and everything will work out. Well, there's a long history of studies as to why that's actually a bad idea and why a whole range of social and economic and cultural factors make that very difficult and very much a long-term prospect in order to do that. We could look at enhancing the capacity and health status of fishing communities, poverty reduction, developing forums to support and maintain ecological knowledge, and investments in strong local governance institutions. So at the local scale, building adaptive capacity often overlaps with key elements of sustainable development. These are things like poverty reduction, improving literacy, adding value to products, and good governance. These are all things we expect that will contribute to adaptive capacity at different scales. Well, the reason this is important is because there aren't a lot of studies on building adaptive capacity. It's sort of, in a sense, a fringe idea that hasn't been mainstreamed, right? Building the capacity of people to deal with something that hasn't happened yet hasn't been a big priority yet, and we don't have very many studies on what to go on. So we need to look for parallels in other fields, and there's a whole field called development studies, which has looked at this, that have brought together anthropologists and development economists and political ecologists to look at the role and impact of development. So there's a lot of lessons in terms of what we should do, and certainly what we shouldn't do in terms of building adaptive capacity that can be learned from these fields. And I think one of the key lessons is that blueprints and panaceas tend not to work, that thou shalt adapt this way tend to result in spectacular failures. So not every community will need the same aspect of adaptive capacity enhanced, and some may already have very diverse livelihood portfolios, and attempts to further diversify livelihoods may have marginal returns or be entirely futile. Likewise, some communities may already have existing common property governance regimes in place, and attempts to introduce a marine protected area because we think everyone wants one may actually undermine these existing governance structures there. So the point here is that adaptation policies have the potential to actually undermine existing sources of resilience where they lie. So not all vulnerable communities are entirely vulnerable in every way, right? So we have to understand a little bit about where existing sources of vulnerabilities and existing sources of resilience lie. Now, I sort of want to start wrapping things up on a sort of cautionary tale, because adaptive capacity in the social science literature tends to be thought of as a positive trait, right? So you're better off as an individual or society being able to adapt to and deal with these changes than not being able to deal with them. It seems like common sense. But when we start thinking about things as linked social ecological systems, things become more complex, because certain types of responses to environmental change have the potential to reinforce or amplify that change, right? So we began exploring this by talking with fishermen in Tanzania and using hypothetical scenarios of decline. And so we asked fishers what they would do in response to a 10, 20, 30, and 50% decline in their normal catch. And I think the results were quite interesting and quite important. So about a third of the fishers would employ what I would call dampening responses. And these were responses such as exiting the fishery or reducing effort, right? About a third of the fishers would continue fishing as is. They wouldn't adapt at all. They wouldn't be able to change things. And a third of the fishers would employ what I would call amplifying responses. These would be things like fishing harder. So we then looked at whether we could predict whether a fisher would fall into these different categories based on certain levels of their adaptive capacity, right? So some of these indicators of adaptive capacity that we looked at. And we found that fishers that would employ a dampening response were those that had livelihood options. Fishers that would continue fishing as normal, that wouldn't adapt at all, right? These were ones that lacked social networks and had low levels of social capital. And fishers that would employ an amplifying response were those that had greater economic wealth, but lacked options. right? So here, this idea of having assets without options actually has the potential to lead to responses that can amplify environmental change. So I think we have to start thinking about, are there opportunities to build dampening adaptive capacity rather than just building adaptive capacity? So the Western Indian Ocean is perhaps one of the most vulnerable regions to climate change globally. And here we began the complicated task of unpacking that to find where existing sources of vulnerabilities lie and communicating these in ways that I think stakeholders and policymakers can visualize solutions to complex problems. And although building social adaptive capacity often overlaps with key elements of sustainable development, key social ecological linkages make these relationships quite complex. So, for example, reducing poverty, escaping poverty, is going to be a critical part of reducing vulnerability in places like East Africa. But as we've seen in the example I just gave, having assets without options has the potential to lead to responses that actually amplify environmental change. So we need to think about how can we reduce vulnerability for society in ways that doesn't undermine the resilience of the broader social ecological system. And I think a key part of this is that blueprint approaches in general are more likely to exacerbate rather than reduce sort of social ecological vulnerability. So the frameworks I presented for examining vulnerability and targeting responses at the appropriate spatial and temporal scale are going to be critical to identifying where existing sources of resilience lie so that adaptation policies don't undermine them. Now, I want to end by just saying that a lot of the concepts that I've talked about today are in a book that's going to be released next week. It's by Oxford University Press. It's published by them. Tim McClanahan and I are the co-authors on that. It's not an edited volume. It's actually an old school real book. It's going to be released in the Western Indian Ocean Marine Science Association conference next week. I think there's a few things about it. One, it's really written for sort of managers and policymakers, and it would probably be appropriate for students too. But that means a few things for the people in the room here. All the sort of nerdy nuances we often like to hide behind, we actually try to get rid of there. The jargon load, which makes us feel really smart and important, we actually tried to navigate away from as well. And I think the other thing is that we tried to bring together a lot of complicated concepts. We dealt with things like the geopolitics of fisheries. We dealt with environmental impacts of climate change on reef systems. We dealt with vulnerability. We developed frameworks to deal with this in a really short space. So probably every specialist in the room has a lot of opinions about why their particular topic should be 80% of the book and the rest is probably just fringe stuff. But we actually tried to give a lot of treatment to a lot of different topics. So anyway, if there's a family member or a colleague that you don't particularly like, you could consider this for a Christmas present. One of our donors has agreed to buy 200 copies of it and distribute it freely to managers and policymakers in the region. But I'm a little bit more ambitious, and I'd like to sell at least 250 copies. So consider that. Thanks, everyone.